1972, late October, 2:14 a.m. Frank Lucas was driving, not going anywhere specific, just moving through Harlem the way he sometimes did late at night when the city was quieter and he could think without interruption. He'd been doing this for years, driving his own neighborhood after midnight, part habit, part surveillance, part something he didn't have a name for, a need to stay connected to the streets that had made him. To feel the pulse of the place he'd been building his empire in for the last decade, tonight felt different. He couldn't explain why, just a restlessness that had started that afternoon and hadn't left, a feeling that something needed to be seen. He turned off 7th Avenue onto 116th Street, his territory, his block, in the way that powerful men think of certain spaces as extensions of themselves. The dealers knew him here, the corner captains reported to people who reported to people who reported to Frank. This was the ground floor of everything he'd built. At 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, Frank pulled his car to the curb on 116th Street and turned off the engine. And then he sat and watched. What he saw that night would stay with him for the rest of his life, not because it was shocking, but because it was familiar. Because he'd seen it 100 times before and never really looked. Tonight, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, Frank looked. He had been making $1 million a week. Blue magic had transformed the Harlem drug market completely. The Italian families had been cut out. The product was purer than anything the streets had seen, more consistent, more available. Frank had built a supply chain that was elegant in its efficiency, direct from source to consumer. No unnecessary steps, no degradation of quality through too many hands. By every business metric Frank applied to his operation, he was operating at the peak of success. The numbers were extraordinary. The product was superior. The distribution was disciplined. The competition was irrelevant. Sitting on 116th Street at 2:14 a.m., Frank watched what those extraordinary numbers looked like at street level. A man in his 30s was sitting against the wall of a closed laundromat, not sitting exactly, collapsed, like a marionette whose strings had been cut. His eyes were open but not seeing. His breathing was visible from the car, shallow, irregular. Frank had seen that pattern before, recognized what it meant. Across the street, a woman was arguing with a dealer Frank recognized, Eddie Ortiz, good earner, reliable, had been working that corner for 3 years. The woman was maybe 25, maybe older, hard to tell. The streets aged people faster than time. She was trying to trade something for product. Eddie was shaking his head. The something she was offering wasn't enough. Frank watched that negotiation without being able to hear it. Watched the woman's posture shift from demanding to pleading. Watched Eddie's indifferent response. Watch the woman turn and walk away with the particular walk of someone who hasn't given up but has been temporarily defeated. She'd be back. They always came back. 2 blocks down, visible from where Frank sat, a young man was on his knees on the sidewalk, not praying, sick. The way blue magic made you sick when the high wore off and the body started its accounting. Frank watched all of this, lit a cigarette, let the smoke fill the car. He thought about numbers. $1 million a week. That was the top line, the success metric, the number that meant he'd won. But sitting on 116th Street watching these 3 people, Frank started doing different math. Not the math of profit and supply. The math of what $1 million a week in heroin sales actually meant on the ground. How many transactions made $1 million? How many people were buying? How many times per week? How much of each purchase was funding a need that couldn't be refused because the body had stopped being able to refuse it? Frank had always thought of his customers in aggregate, markets, demographics, demand curves, the way any businessman thought about customers, abstractly, functionally, the man against. The laundromat wall wasn't abstract. The woman negotiating with Eddie wasn't demographic. The young man sick on the sidewalk wasn't a demand curve. They were people, Harlem people, people who'd grown up in the same neighborhoods Frank had worked for 26 years, who'd gone to schools nearby, who had mothers and sisters and probably children somewhere. Frank had known this theoretically, wasn't naive about what his product did. Had always understood in the abstract that addiction was part of the mechanism, that the reliability of Blue Magic's customer base depended on the reliability of the need, that the business worked in part because people couldn't stop, but abstract understanding and watching it at 2:14 a.m. on 116th Street were different things. Frank thought about Bumpy Johnson, what Bumpy had taught him. Bumpy had operated in Harlem for decades and had maintained something Frank was only now questioning his own relationship to, a genuine sense of connection to the community. Bumpy had run numbers, yes, had enforced with violence when necessary, yes, but Bumpy had also protected people, had given back, had been something complicated, not a hero, but not purely extractive either. Frank had told himself he was doing the same, that his success benefited Harlem, that the money circulated. That he employed people, that he gave to the community. Sitting on 116th Street, Frank was less sure about those justifications, because what he was watching wasn't a community being served, it was a community being consumed. Blue magic was extraordinary precisely because it was so effective, so pure, so much more addictive than what had been available before. Frank had built a better product, and what a better product meant in this particular market was faster addiction, deeper dependency, more reliable demand. He'd improved the quality of the thing that was destroying his neighborhood. Frank lit a second cigarette, watched Eddie Ortiz do 2 more transactions from the corner. Professional, efficient, just like Frank had built the system to be. A car drove slowly past. Frank recognized it, one of his people, night patrol. Making sure the corners were running smoothly. The man in the car nodded at Eddie. Eddie nodded back, the system checking on itself. Frank thought about a conversation he'd had 6 months ago with an older man named Calvin Webb. Calvin had been in Harlem since before Frank arrived, 60 years in the neighborhood, had seen everything. Calvin had found Frank after community meeting about neighborhood deterioration, had said to him quietly so nobody else could hear, "You know what you're doing to this place." It hadn't been a question, it had been a statement, delivered without anger, just recognition. Frank had given his standard response, that he was meeting existing demand, that if he didn't supply it, someone else would, that the community had bigger problems than his operation. Calvin had looked at him with tired eyes. "You always were smart, Frank, smart enough to build all this, smart enough to know exactly what you're doing and smart enough to explain it away to yourself. That's the dangerous kind of smart." Then Calvin had walked away, and Frank had dismissed the conversation, filed it under the category of people who didn't understand how business worked. But Calvin's words came. Back now, sitting on 116th Street, watching, "You always were smart enough to explain it away to yourself." Frank thought about the man against the laundromat wall, thought about what that man's life looked like from the inside. Woke up needing something, spent the day finding money for it, made the transaction, brief relief, then the cycle starting again. Every day, the same cycle, the same need, the same transaction. And Frank's operation was on the other side of every one of those transactions, taking money, providing the product that made the cycle inevitable, building the walls of that cycle higher with every improvement in purity. Blue magic was called blue magic because it seemed magical compared to what came before, more powerful, more consistent, more effective. What it was more effective at was creating exactly what Frank was watching on 116th Street. Frank started driving again, couldn't sit still with the thought. He moved through Harlem, block by block, looking at it differently than he had in years, not looking for business intelligence or competitive intelligence or security concerns, looking at the actual condition of the neighborhood. What he saw was damage, not dramatic, obvious damage. The slow, accumulated damage of a community losing people to addiction year after year. The closed businesses, the buildings going unmaintained, the vacant lots that had once been things, the particular exhaustion visible on the faces of people who spent every day watching their neighborhood diminish. Frank had always attributed Harlem's deterioration to larger forces: poverty, racism, disinvestment, government neglect, all of which were real, all of which were true, but he had added to it, had accelerated it, had made it efficient. He drove to a diner on 125th Street that stayed open all night, sat in a back booth, ordered coffee. The waitress was a woman he'd seen there before, maybe 40, had a son in school somewhere. Frank knew this because he paid attention to people around him, had always paid attention. He looked at her, really looked at her. Thought about what her neighborhood looked like compared to what it had looked like when she was a child. Thought about what she saw when she walked home after her shift. Thought about whether she worried about her son. Frank drank his coffee. Thought about what he was actually building. Not an empire, not power, not freedom from the powerlessness he'd felt as a 12-year-old in North Carolina. He was building a machine for extracting value from human suffering. Efficient, disciplined, well-organized extraction. Better than what had come before, more effective, higher quality. He thought about that man against the laundromat wall. That man was Frank's product doing its job, working exactly as designed, the purity ensuring maximum effect, the distribution ensuring maximum availability, the pricing ensuring maximum accessibility. Success by every metric Frank had been using, he thought about what it would mean to stop, not just for him, not just his freedom or his money or his power, but what stopping would actually accomplish. The demand would still exist, other suppliers would fill it, less pure product maybe, more expensive maybe, but the demand didn't disappear because Frank Lucas stopped supplying it. This was the argument Frank had used for years to justify continuing, that his presence in the market was, in a perverse way, preferable to the alternative, that he provided consistent quality, that people buying from him weren't getting cut product that could kill them, that in a world where the demand existed regardless, he was the better option. Sitting in the diner at 3 a.m., Frank examined that argument more carefully than he ever had, and what he found was that it was true. And it was also complete self-serving rationalization, both things at once. That was the uncomfortable reality. Frank's product was genuinely higher quality than alternatives, and Frank's product was genuinely accelerating the destruction of the community he'd spent 26 years living in. Both. The math of 2 million a week didn't balance against what was happening on 116th Street, couldn't balance, the units weren't comparable. Frank paid for his coffee, left the diner, drove home. He didn't sleep that night, sat in his study until morning thinking, and here was the thing that would haunt him for decades. The thing that made that night different from all the other nights when he'd known in some abstract way what he was doing. He understood now, really understood, not abstractly, specifically, concretely. He understood what blue magic did to the people on 116th Street, understood the mechanism, understood the human cost, and the next morning he went back to work. That was the most honest and most difficult part of the story. The understanding didn't change the behavior. The clarity didn't produce the decision to stop. Frank kept the operation running for 3 more years after that. Night on 116th Street, kept making the $1 million a week, kept expanding distribution, kept improving the system, because the alternative, stopping or being stopped, felt like a return to powerlessness, like giving back the distance he'd put between himself and the 12-year-old in North Carolina who watched his cousin tied to a tree, like becoming small again. So Frank kept going, with full understanding of what he was doing. And that full understanding made it worse, not better, worse, because there's a specific kind of self-knowledge that doesn't liberate you. That just means you watch yourself do the thing anyway. That just means you understand your own complicity with perfect clarity and proceed regardless. Frank Lucas had that kind of self-knowledge after that night on 116th Street, years later in prison. In interviews in his final decades, Frank would talk about that night, not always directly, but it was there in the subtext of what he said when he was being honest. I knew what I was doing, Frank said once. That's different from not knowing. When you know and you keep going, that's a different kind of thing. That's a choice. Someone asked him what he'd do differently. Frank was quiet for a while, stopped sooner, not because I got caught, before I got caught. Before it went as long as it did. Why didn't you? Frank gave the honest answer, because stopping felt like losing, and I was raised to never lose, built my whole life around never losing. Stopping felt like everything I'd run from catching up with me. Was it worth it, the years you kept going after you understood? No, Frank said, nothing about it was worth it after that night, but I didn't know how to be the kind of man who stopped. That was the problem, not what I knew, who I was, that was the truth of it, not ignorance, character. Frank Lucas understood what he was doing on 116th Street, understood it completely, and kept doing it anyway because stopping would have meant becoming someone different, someone he didn't know how to be. The empire lasted 3 more years after that October night. Then the FBI raid, the arrest, 15 years in prison, the slow rebuilding of a different kind of life. But that night in October 1972, sitting on 116th Street at 2:14 a.m. watching the man against the laundromat wall and the woman negotiating with Eddie Ortiz and the young man sick on the sidewalk, that night was when Frank Lucas lost the ability to claim he didn't know. He knew he'd always known in some way, but that night he knew completely. And he kept going anyway. That's the real story. Not the empire, not the fall, but the night in between when a man driving through his own neighborhood saw exactly what he'd built and chose with full awareness to keep building it. That choice, more than any arrest or sentence or cooperation deal, defined who Frank Lucas was, not the hunger or the poverty or the ambition. This moment of understanding followed by continuation. The man who saw clearly and proceeded anyway. That was Frank Lucas. After October 1972, for 3 more years, until the FBI made the choice for him that he hadn't been able to make for himself. He understood. He knew. He went back to work, and that was the thing prison never touched, the thing no sentence could address, the weight of knowing you saw it clearly and kept going regardless. Frank Lucas carried that weight until the day he died, called it by different names at different times, but always came back to the same place, the same October night, the same 116th Street, the same 2:14 a.m.